This is AIM Agenda. With me this morning, Brendan O'Connor and Steve Ciobo, Liberal frontbencher in Sydney this morning. You were on the ABC last night, Steve Ciobo, and there was that question from an individual who had been accused of terrorism offences, was subsequently cleared, and you had a pretty frank assessment to that individual. No regrets this morning on that?
Look, absolutely not. I mean, obviously caught me on the hop in the sense that I didn't know the full background about that gentleman, but from what I could recall, I'm pretty sure that the only reason that he got off on the terrorism offences was because they didn't apply in retrospectivity. They didn't apply in a retrospective sense. So, you know, it's a fundamental point, Kieran, that if someone is engaging in terrorist activity, that frankly, if they're a dual citizen, they should have their citizenship revoked. And that's fundamentally what this government is making a stand on. We do not want these people, if they've been fighting for a terrorist organisation, to come back into the country. We don't want them back here. Labor's the party that's proposing that they come back to Australia. The coalition is saying we don't want you back in Australia. And in the case of that individual last night, you know, frankly, if they're a dual citizen and they're in Australia, well, I think we should get rid of them if they're engaged in terrorist activities.
So do you think that the laws, if they were in place at the time, that individual might have been caught up in the laws? Is that your understanding?
Well, that's my memory. I mean, bear in mind this is nearly a decade ago, so I was just going off memory. But that's certainly my understanding of what took place. But I mean, look, you know, at the end of the day, this particular person's circumstances and their actual status at law is something, I guess, that we'll discover in the fullness of time. But I mean, you know, his comments last night as well, and there were subsequent tweets as well, where he tweeted subsequently that he would like to pay money. You know, ostensibly it would seem to have me kidnapped and taken to Iraq based upon the tweet that he actually put out there. I mean, it just demonstrates this is a sick individual, frankly.
Yeah, Brendan O'Connor, your thoughts on all of that?
Oh, clearly I have no sympathy for the person who asked the question. I don't know the detail. The only thing I would say is probably hard to reflect and be conclusive about what happens in a case if you don't know the detail. But again, Labor does support the government in stripping the dual citizenship from Australians who take up arms against this country, and we're waiting for the legislation. And as soon as that comes in, if it's based on that assertion that we need to be able to remove that entitlement from someone who takes up arms against this country, fighting for Daesh, then the Labor will support the government.
Now, but you would accept, though, that a lot of those that have seen Steve Ciobo's comments this morning would have a lot of sympathy for the way he responded, and would relate to the way he responded to that particular individual.
Yeah, I'm just saying,
the question.
As a lawmaker, you probably have to be mindful. I mean, Steve's own comment was, I don't know the details of the case. Well, and then went on to conclude. Now, I understand entirely why Steve responded that way. This person certainly seems to be of bad character. He has, and the allegations against him are very, very serious, and he was acquitted.
Some of the tweets are outright disgusting.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to be. I can assure you, I would not defend that person one bit. I'm just saying the byplay between Steve and him was unfortunate, but there's no support, as far as I'm concerned, for a person who is actually threatened ASIO officials and others in this country. I don't know the reasons why he was acquitted, but let's just turn to the substantive.
All right, but we'll get to that in a tick.
We support legislation of its stripping dual citizenship.
I know, and Michelle Rowland made that clear yesterday on the program, that when it comes to Section 35 and amending that Labor's going to back it. You know, you want to see the detail, obviously, but you're going to back it. So, Steve Ciobo, you can respond to that, and I guess, you know, in light of your suggestion earlier that Labor was not going to support it, they are. And you know, the other thing I wanted to ask you, were you surprised when the audience last night actually clapped that individual that you had a crack at?
Well, you know, I guess the people that were disagreeing vehemently with what he said weren't in a position to really respond. I'm not sure. I mean, look, frankly, of course, I was a little surprised, frankly, that a guy who openly admitted on the floor of the audience that he had worked to look at trying to murder Australian officials, in particular officers of the law who actually put their lives on the line to pretend, not to pretend I should say, but to protect Australian values. I mean, seriously, people were applauding that. I just found that extraordinary. I mean, obviously it wasn't everyone, it was only a small section of the crowd, but to go back to your point, Kieran, about Labor's position, I've got to be honest with you, I have no understanding of what Labor's position is because they keep shifting. I mean, Brendan's sitting there saying, well, no, we're supportive in principle.
Steve, that's
no,
the cabinet.
Brendan, you're turning around and saying that you're supportive in principle, but then, you know, Mark Dreyfus, the Shadow Attorney General said, no, you've got to bring them back to Australia. So I guess my straightforward question to Labor is, does Labor require people to have...
Steve, you finish without interruption. I'll come back to Brendan.
Okay. Thanks, Kieran. I just want to know, does Labor require someone to have a conviction or not? Because the Shadow Attorney General made it clear that that was what Labor was looking for. So is Brendan saying that Labor is not requiring a conviction, is he?
No, I think it's fair to say that the government originally sought the opposition's support for foreign fighters legislation, that is to bring in penalties for people. The only reason they would want to do that was to prosecute people before our courts. Subsequently, the government has now said they want to make sure they ban citizenship from dual citizens, and we've said in principle we support that, but we need to see the legislation. Let's remember the Cabinet has been toing and froing on this, and in fact the Prime Minister looks like he's actually been rolled by his own Cabinet now because there will be some judicial involvement or oversight in the process. But until we see the detail of the proposed legislation, it's hard to comment on all aspects. But I can assure you, Kieran, and your viewers that Labor stands with the government in stripping the citizenship of a dual citizen if they take up arms against this country, whether it's state to state or whether it's fighting for Daesh.
Okay, and I guess in that context, Steve, I should ask you, is this not a win for Malcolm Turnbull and co, who had argued that the government needs to tread carefully in terms of not wanting to breach the separation of powers? Because if you're expanding Section 35 of the Citizenship Act, that obviously is a nod to that concern.
Well, the government's always been focused on making sure that any proposal we put forward is consistent with the obligations that we have under the Constitution. I mean, that's a statement of the obvious, frankly, Kieran. You know, Brendan just tried to point score and make the claim that all of a sudden we're including judicial review. Well, that was always under consideration. Judicial review was always going to be part of the process, and in fact it's part of the natural order of decision making from ministers. So, you know, despite the rhetoric from Labor that this is some kind of new outcome, the fact is that's been in place since the outset.
There's another Green paper out today on another issue, the front of the Financial Review today, about health funding. Quickly to both of you on that, only a minute left. Steve, to you, any chance of this happening where the states take full control of the health system?
Well, look, we're wanting to have a white paper discussion in relation to the Federation. Part of that includes a discussion, and I emphasise a discussion. It's not government policy. It's just a discussion paper to generate ideas, but it is not government policy. And in fact, we're increasing health funding by $3.8 billion or 25% over the next 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah. And yesterday,
do we cue the scare campaign from Labor?
Well, I think yesterday we had concerns about parents paying for public education. Today we see there's more cost shifting going on by the federal government. This is after, of course, the Prime Minister.
It's a Green paper.
Well, the Green paper, and written by the Prime Minister's own department, and in that it talks about stripping money from the states in health. And we saw yesterday the idea that we might be having parents paying for public education. This is cost shifting by the Commonwealth to states, and it's contrary to the commitments made by the Prime Minister before the election.
We're out of time. Brendan O'Connor, Steve Ciobo. Thanks, gents. A quick break,
Kieran.
back in just a moment.
Thanks, Steve. Cheers.